Okay, once again, it's good to be on the program with you, Robin, in terms of our continued discussions.
Greetings, sir.
Where we are as African people, and in a sense where we need to be for the new millennium and the new configuration, shall we say, of the world that's coming up, because the global is changing, and we need to change along with that. And we're stuck in a historic bubble, and I think it's important for us as a people to recognize that, because we don't recognize to what extent history has shaped who we are and where we are and how we see the world. Because history is more than dates. And I think what has happened is that history has been the history that has been given to us as a reality, as the only reality, as the way in which the world is and always has been, and always must be. And if you just and it's like a subliminal influence on us. Because at the same time, we're being told that history isn't important, so to speak. It's a bunch of dates and so on. And you don't really pay that much attention to history. These Europeans pretend they don't pay attention to history. It's just there. But let's just take 1492 as a date. Because that's how history is taught, as dates. On such and such a date, such and such a thing happened. Well, 1492, Columbus discovered the New World. Really? But we're taught that as a fact. That's a historical fact. And we learn that from the time we were in kindergarten or wherever it is. And this is even, part of the legal framework of the world in which we live, that Columbus discovered the New World, and all of these people that were there were discovered. And somehow then that gives, Columbus and Spain and Portugal the right to this discovery and anything that they want to do with it. And we just sort of accept that because that's the history that we learned growing up. And it's there in the background, but we don't question it. So, using that as an example, we can fast forward to see how the genocide that was perpetrated behind that so-called discovery has been papered over in terms of history as something that was natural and in the course of events, as Europeans discovering the world outside of Europe. And we fast forward now to the genocide in Gaza and Palestine, where history is being written. And it's that, this land belongs to a certain people, and those other people, they have no right to be there. So again, history is being rewritten without any understanding of the connection between a 1492 and a 2024, 2023. And it shows you how the minds of people have been conditioned between that period of time, which, my mathematics tell me is about 500 to 600 years ago. And now, what took place after 1492 is acceptable. And what is taking place now in 2024 is also acceptable. So turn that inside out, and it sees how the interpretation of that history has shaped our minds and that history shapes psychology, because that's the world in which we live. That is what is taught to us. That is what conditions our minds. And that is what we accept, and that is how we behave. And we spread that out now in terms of us as African people who have gone through our Holocaust in terms of the enslavement and then also the colonialism. And again, you can fast forward to Congo. What is happening in Congo? You can fast forward to Sudan. What is happening in Sudan? There's genocide there, there's genocide there. And it's the same thing that, resources are being extracted, to provide, for the benefit of Europeans, whether they're on the continent of Europe, shall we say, or in the Americas. So what has changed? Again, because of the way in which history has been rewritten or written, and the way in which that shapes your mind as a psychological process. And when I say psychological, then it's not just psychological, because then it's sociological, and then it's also political, because it shapes your whole life. And you get back to what Dad's saying, a people without the knowledge of their past history, traditions, and culture is like a tree without roots. But you look at that from another perspective, your history shapes you as a person. But you also write the history, whether you perpetrate that history or you change that history. Somebody wrote that history, somebody has rewritten that history. And I don't think we understand the extent to which we live in a universe that has been defined by the people who have written the history relative to the universe. This has been left out, that has been put in. This has been valorized or validated by so-called historical facts. And that is considered to be non-essential or even primitive, or even almost subhuman or non-human. How could people do those things? Animism, polytheism, those things are primitive, as opposed to monotheism and materialism. I can kind of go on, but the historiography and the historian has a major role to play in terms of the ability to transform the minds of African people, because our minds have been captured by the historical process, which has been rewritten, since at least the 17th and 18th century. And Robin, jump in there and correct me, if I'm wrong, or elaborate on how you see it as a historian.
This is how I see it. 1492 is an important date in history for one reason. The world as we know it today, with Europeans at the top and Africans and Native Americans at the bottom, that's when that world began. The world of the Atlantic, where the Atlantic Ocean and trade connections and cultural connections, that's when it began. Very, very important. But by writing the history in the way where Columbus is on the pedestal and he's the hero, there's obviously problems with that. The genocide of the Native Americans, there's obviously problems with that. The mass enslavement of Africans, there's obviously problems with that. Now, first question is, as Africans, what should we teach about 1492? There's a theory that is being widely entertained that there was a Malian voyage to the Americas, possibly 1311, and possibly involving the Malian king at the time, the emperor, Mansa Abubakari II. And he and his crew are said to have landed in Panama in 1311, of which skeletal evidence in Danish Virgin Islands has been found. an African inscription has been found, and Malian place names exist or existed on Panamanian maps right up until the 19th century, and no one wants to explain how those place names got there. And Black people appear in Native American art of the 14th century. So there's a lot of data that seems to come together. Should Africans speak about that instead of Columbus? You see, we have the option of doing so. In my book, When We Ruled, I cite evidence that in Yoruba land, there's a city-state called Ile-Ife, which is the holy city of the Yorubas, and it's paved. And the pavements are made from Native American corn cobs. And since the Yoruba city of Ile-Ife was paved in the year 1000 AD, which is 500 years before Columbus, that raises the possibility that either the Yorubas landed in the Americas and loaded up corn cobs, or Native Americans landed in Yoruba land with ships full of corn cobs, or some other trade took place. Again, do we make that the story instead of Christopher Columbus? Right? And essentially, what happened in the era of Christopher Columbus, there's a famous Black studies person in Britain, Dr. Onyeka Nubia, and his point is this: if we go back 600 years, Europeans were only on one continent, Europe. That's it. From being on one continent, they are now the dominant population in North America, Central America, South America, the dominant population in Australasia, the dominant population in Southern Africa, the dominant population in Israel, Palestine, Lebanon. And how did they become the dominant population? We have to raise the question of genocide. And finally, let me just make one point, which I want to go into at a greater level, and that is the link between history and all the other subjects. Because the way you teach history affects the teaching of every other discipline. And essentially, if you found a discipline on the wrong sense of history, everything else you teach in all these multiple disciplines, so it's not just psychology, it's not just sociology, it's on every discipline. And we're in a position now to begin the fight back to correct the teachings in other disciplines.
I think that's an extremely important point, and that's sort of what I was suggesting: the subliminal nature of the historical process and how it influences us. Because as you so rightfully say, it's in every other discipline as a foundation. For example, going to medical school, etc. I learned that Hippocrates was the father of medicine. Well, of course, I also learned later on that was BS. Imhotep was the father of medicine, and the Greeks learned about medicine from Egypt, and the Egyptians were the great medical personages and teachers of that whole area, Mediterranean, Near East, etc., for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. So there's a total perversion of the science of medicine. Again, to claim it as a Greek phenomenon in terms of its starting. You do the same thing. You're studying math, and you can elaborate on this, as you say, but you learn about the Pythagoras theorem, and quite frankly, Pythagoras didn't write anything and leave anything, but the Pythagoras theorem, what it's based on, was already prevalent in Egypt and part of its science. And you do the same thing with geometry, and they talk about Euclidean geometry. And everybody knows that geometry started in Egypt, and those principles that are called Euclidean geometry, again, they're Egyptian. And then if you go to, philosophy, and with Plato and Socrates and Thales and all of these other people, but you take it from there, because that's exactly true.
Okay, let me suggest what could be taught. You mentioned your background in medicine. These are the kinds of things that could be taught if we Africanized the medical curriculum. In 1980, an article appeared called Tetracycline Labeled Bone from Ancient Sudanese Nubia. And what they discovered was that in Sudan, in the early medieval period, between around about 250 AD to 550 AD, the Sudanese had invented the antibiotic tetracycline, and they were using this tetracycline. They presumably made it through an antibiotic beer that they created. And the result then is that scholars in Science magazine have come to the conclusion that the antibiotic tetracycline is of Sudanese origins. And then we have other examples as well. If we take what we know about Ethiopia, we know that there are Ethiopian medical manuscripts from the second half of the 18th century. And these manuscripts describe treatments for epilepsy, fever, syphilis, rabies, skin diseases, kidney problems, hemorrhoids, constipation, diarrhea, dysuria, itching, coughing, sterility, etc., etc. And we know from not just from the documents, but from people visiting Ethiopia, how Ethiopians controlled the spread of epidemics like smallpox and cholera. We know that when it comes to things like inoculation of the populations against smallpox, Ethiopia was one of many African civilizations that had the smallpox vaccine before the Europeans. Moreover, 19th century Ethiopian manuscripts tell us that the incubation period for rabies was 40 days. We also have, there was a scholar called Dr. Bryant, and he spent years living amongst Zulu practitioners of medicine. And he wrote a book called Zulu Medicine and Medicine Men, describing the 700 plants that were used in Zulu medicine and the different ways of administering medicine, including cold infusions that combined cold water with chopped or powdered medicine, medicines given as hot infusions like tea, medicines given as powders, medicines given as liquid, ointments, lotions, etc., where in Zulu medicine, traditional Zulu medicine, they could treat broken limbs and sprains, catarrh, chest pains, chronic coughing, dropsy, dry cough, earache, eczema, etc., etc., etc. And so what it means then is we can write such a history. When it comes to West African medicine, we know that at the University of Jene, one of the ancient universities that existed during the Mali and Songhai period, we know that they were removing eye cataracts, and that is specifically mentioned. In fact, there's a famous Songhai medical historical text called the Tariq el-Sudan, and the author of that text, his brother had undergone one of the cataract surgeries. Similarly, when it comes to things like the treatment of diabetes and so on and so forth, there are plenty of African treatments like this. And we know that the smallpox vaccine that Africans had is the same one that was brought to the Americas by an enslaved African called Wanzimus. And Wanzimus helped in the suppression of smallpox in Boston in 1720. And that's the first example of the use of smallpox vaccine in America. That's the origins of it. So we can rewrite the medical thing. And if we want to go even further, you could bring up the likes of Dr. Charles Richard Drew. We could bring up the likes of Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, the second person in the world to do an open heart surgery. And we can then take the story up. In Britain, the most famous Black Briton is the Creole Jamaican nurse, Mary Seacole. And she was using West African superfoods and technologies which suppressed cholera in Central America. And she was responsible for bringing certain technologies to the Crimea War. And in the case of Mary Seacole, using traditional West African techniques, she never lost a mother or a baby when it came to delivering of children. So consequently, the value of these technologies, these medical breakthroughs, and we can do this not just with medicine, we can do it with all the STEM subjects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, we can go back to Egypt as well with that, because I've been there. I've looked at their different papyri, the Ebers papyrus and so on, and other papyri that describe certain medical conditions. I've seen inscriptions, their hieroglyphics, inscriptions of their medical instruments that they did trephinations and so on with. So all of those surgical sciences, et cetera, were prevalent in Egypt. I mean, you know, again, hundreds of years before in Europe. And you know, I think that is so important. And I want to come back to the psychological and in a sense the social and also the economic, because you know the scientific is clearly, as you have enumerated it and enlightened us with those details, and as you say, you can go even further into more detail. But you know, everything depends on a mindset, and we believe, you know, just coming to mind, you know, I remember growing up in Jamaica and going to the movies on a Saturday. We used to have matinees and so on and so forth. And before the movie started, you know, the royal anthem would play, you know, God Save the King or God Save the Queen, you know, and we had to stand up, you know, and the anthem went something like, God Save our gracious Queen, you know, long may she live and long may she reign over us, you know, happy and glorious. I mean, these were the things that were being inculcated into our minds as a subterfuge. In other words, we were accepting her rulership, and the historicity of her rulership was not being shown to us in its nakedness. How many people were killed for her to be able to rule over us? But we were getting this music and this pageantry, you know, and as this spoon feeding of the reality in which we were living. And of course, we just accepted this. Well, you know, growing up in the household that I grew up in, I would not stand up because you're supposed to stand up when this royal anthem was played. And you'd be surprised to know how many adults looked around at me and said, "What's wrong with you, boy? You don't have respect for the Queen." You know, and of course, I didn't have any respect for the Queen because, you know, I knew the history. And we get back to that problem. We don't know the history. And we don't know the alternative history because it hasn't been written. And, you know, it needs to be written, that whole concept of who writes the history, the historiography. And that whole, you know, as we were saying, that it would be written in the 17th, 18th century to justify the enslavement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, that's something that I feel so frustrated that we don't have our fingers on that in terms of us as a people. If we're looking or thinking about Pan-Africanism, if we're looking and thinking about the African Union, and the unity of the diasporas, the sixth region with the continent, the whole effort of history that has to go into that in order to bind us appropriately in terms of the knowledge base that us in the diaspora need to have about the continent, and those on the continent need to have about the diaspora. And therefore the linking of the two, which would be seamless in terms of the fact that we need unity of our 1.5 billion people to really, deal with the future as it's coming up, because we need a federated United States of Africa, and we need the diaspora as a sixth region, and we need to have this understanding of our relationship to each other. And behind the understanding of our relationship to each other is the understanding of how we got here. Because having understood how we got here, then we have to understand how we deal with this current situation to transform it so that we don't keep repeating history, because that's what has happened. Even though there's been the independence throughout the 60s, from 1960 to 57, really, Ghana going on, and so on, it's been nominal independence, flag independence, national anthem independence, but not economic independence. It's been neocolonialism. We've seen the coups, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen the fragmentation, with Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali, kicking the French out, and we have the other ECOWAS states, including Nigeria, saying, you can't do that, you can't have a coup. I mean, it's undemocratic. But what's democratic about the democracy that's there? I mean, there's nothing democratic about it at all. It's simply being manipulated from the metropole in terms of Paris or other European capitals. And I'm very, very happy to see that there's a young generation that seems to be they're very, very dissatisfied with the existential historical situation in which they're in, and they're trying to change it. But in order to change it properly, this is the concept of revolution. The revolution has to be deeper than a change in government. It has to be at a very, very deep level. And somebody like Frantz Fanon understood that when he was talking about the Algerian Revolution and the mindset that had to take place in order for the Algerian Revolution not just to be a revolution in isolation in terms of an African revolution, but how the other African revolutions, had to become real. They had to become real in the minds of the people, because it was essentially a psychological process. Because, as you know, Frantz Fanon was a psychiatrist himself, and I think that was his main, contribution. Black skin, white mask, and the wretched of the earth. Those of us who were participating in the process of our own dehumanization and didn't really understand decolonization and what was necessary for decolonization. So there's definitely that that junction, shall we say, between the history and the psychological process, and then the rest of how we live, which is the sociological, as well as the scientific that you brought up, as well as the political. Who do you vote for, and why would you vote for him? And how does he become a leader? A leader of what? What is he repeating? I mean, the Westminster, type of so-called democracy, the ideology that he learned at Oxford and Cambridge or MIT, or is he learning something that is really indigenous to African people and that will help African people solve their problems? So there's that lacuna, if you will, in our effort to move from point A to point B. And point B meaning the previous enslavement, the previous colonization, the current neo-colonization. All of that is just the same thing being stretched out in a different format. And we have to change the format. And, in some sense, I'm making the point, you're making the point that history is significant. We have to rewrite our history so that we can actually capture the minds of our youth. And this is the juncture that I'm trying to get to when I mentioned the coups that are taking place in West Africa. And hopefully they will continue, because I think the young people are restless across the continent. But they need something to help to shape their minds. But because again, if you look at the kind of thing that's going through WhatsApp and TikTok, they're grasping at something to make them feel good. In terms of history, you'll see something said, oh, they didn't know about the Roman Empire, emperor, what's his name, Severus or something like that. And so I said, my God, yeah, really, really, really. So you're getting these new landmarks, but they're landmarks without the background to it, which is what somebody like you as a historian will provide. So go a little bit deeper into that in terms of what you're doing and how can we expand that, Robin?
I'm a lot more optimistic because my argument isn't that we need to write it. A lot of it has been written. We need to popularize it. Mm-hmm. To give an example, I used to be a school teacher, and I remember looking on a mathematics wall, and it had the Roman numerical system of I, Another maths classroom wall had a poster of the Pythagorean theorem. And what these mathematics classrooms were teaching wasn't just maths. They were also teaching that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans were very, very clever people. And if you look at the study of any subject in the European power structure, the subject will always begin with the ancient Greeks and the Romans. Then it will get into the European medieval and Renaissance periods. Then it will get into the 18th century Enlightenment era. Then it will get into the modern period. It doesn't matter what the subject is. If it's chemistry, that's how it will be taught. If it's physics, that's how it will be taught. If it's sports, that's how it will be taught. If it's dance, that's how it will be taught. And so what you end up with is a tour of European culture with no exceptions to this. Now, when Monsieur Fanon wrote Black Skin, White Masks, he pricked away at that model and suggested an alternative way that we could look at psychology. When he wrote The Wretched of the Earth, he turned his ideas into a revolutionary theory. Now, Monsieur Fanon started something, but others continued it. Professor Naim Akbar continued it. Dr. Francis Cress-Welsing, Wade Nobles, Linda Myers, etc., etc., etc. And the result is we are starting to create an African-centered psychology. And other people have done similar things with sociology. When Professor Diop wrote The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, and then Oba Shaka grabbed that book, ran with it, and produced Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. That could be the template for an African-centered sociology. And then if you then add to that what Professor Du Bois did with his book, The Philadelphia Negro, and people like E. Franklin Frazier and what they did with their books, his books like Black Bourgeoisie, people like Professor Nathan and Dr. Julia Hare, what they did with their books, Crisis in Black Sexual Politics. They've created a Black nationalist and Afrocentric sociology. So there's another template there that's been built. And if we then look at the other subjects, because one of the things that I am very concerned about is I don't want people to think that African culture is merely intangibles. So when it becomes intangibles, it becomes behavioral things. Yes, the behavioral things are important, but there's concrete things as well. And for example, it's very important that modern African countries and modern Caribbean countries and African Americans learn from our architectural past. And the view of African architecture from our perspective, revolutionizing the perspective. Scholars have done this. There's a scholar called Professor Nnamdi Ele, who wrote the book African Architecture, Evolution and Transformation, where he's talking about the 8 or so different traditions of ancient African architecture. And some of those traditions are splendid indeed. For example, some of the East African traditions, where people in medieval times were living in 1 to 5 story stone houses with toilets, with bathrooms. Their cities had water fountains, and you can see the ruins of one such water fountain in the ruined city of Gedi on the coast of Kenya. I know this because I've got the photograph. So when it comes to how we build today, there are traditions that we can build on without copying Europe. And so what it means then is our ability to transform the environment and transform it architecturally. We can do it, we can modernize it, and we don't have to rely on European traditions anymore, especially if we knew our own. So when you look at Nnamdi Ele, he will talk about the pharaonic traditions of Egypt and Kush, the Western Sudanic traditions of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The grandest monument in that tradition is the Grand Mosque of Djenné, which looks like an overgrown sandcastle, the largest clay brick building on earth. Then you've got the Moorish architecture of Morocco and Spain, and a lot of that stuff was built by Black people originally. Then you've got the various traditions along the West African coast, what's called impluvium architecture. The royal palace of Benin in medieval times was said to have been able to accommodate 15,000 people. Source, Captain Richard Burton, right? So consequently, when it comes to massive, grand architecture, we did it. But what it is because most of us today don't know that that research has been done. So it's not we need to write this, it's been written. What we need to do is popularize this so that the young revolutionaries, for example, the young man that's just taken over in Senegal, knows that when he's able to make decisions about big constructions in Senegal, he can do it and stick strictly within African architectural traditions. He doesn't have to look to Europe. Mm-hmm. And this is how we can change the game. So in other words, we have enough information to revolutionize every subject, with the possible exception of economics. I think we had this conversation before. We can revolutionize everything else with what we have right now. And I believe that is the message that we need to get out to the people. The content has been written. What it needs to be now is popularized.
Well, I think that's really also, a part of what we need to do, because we can't point the finger at anybody else. We are the problem as well as the solution to the problem. If we identify the problem, then we have also to identify the solution and carry it forward. Again, with Frantz Fanon's quote that every generation has to outline its difficulties, shall we say, and deal with them. Otherwise, they'll be a failed generation. That's a paraphrase. I can't remember the exact quote, but you know exactly what I'm saying. Which I think kind of moves us in the direction of culture, because architecture doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists within institutions, shall we say, institutions of a kingdom, institutions of a governance structure, a religious entity, a tribe, or whatever you want to call it. And I think that's an area that we need to move towards. And, we've been talking about education, we've been talking about history. I think we need to talk about, culture per se, because everything ends up as a manifestation of culture, which is the final expression, shall we say, of our history and our educational process, meaning how do we manifest that in our day-to-day life, in the food that we eat, in the clothes that we wear, in the buildings that we build, and in our relationships to each other, and to nature and the environment. And all of that is sort of conceptualized on the culture. And of course, there's a deep culture and there's a superficial culture. Very often the people look at song and dance as culture, but like everything else, song and dance is based on something else. It's like Bob Marley is a popularizer, shall we say, of many of my father's thoughts as well as many of his Selassie's thoughts, and his capacity to put them in a certain lyrical form as well as a musical form, and to make them therefore popular, and therefore to be able to carry the message. But the message is the deeper aspect of the culture, like redemption song that comes out of Marcus Garvey's speech in 1937, in Halifax, Nova Scotia, liberate your lives from mental slavery, because none but ourselves can free our mind. Of course, Bob adds on, have no fear of atomic energy, because none of them can stop the time. So there's the superficial culture, there's the deep culture, and very often we valorize, if you will, the superficial culture because that's very entertaining, without understanding the message that it is bringing to us and the deep aspect of it. And I think that's how our culture very often gets captured by mainstream, shall we say, and then it gets transformed into something that's purely entertainment, when it started out as a genuine cultural expression of a people with a historical background and a historical context of where they are in terms of the whole life process. And for example, the blues. The blues, came out of the existential situation of working from sun up to sundown, picking cotton, with somebody behind you whipping you, and working you to death. And that was the
Can I jump in there, sir?
God, please do, yes.
Yeah, and the blues has an African origin. It's thought to come from Mali, medieval Mali. And there's one theory that it says that it came from the Malian cities, your Timbuktu, Genes, and so on. And there's a second theory that it came from the Malian deserts. And the people in the deserts would be the Tuaregs, and the Tuaregs wear blue. So when that culture was transferred into the Americas, it became remembered as the music of the blue men. So that's where we get this notion of the blues. So what happens is that then, and also, I think we need to guard against this idea that music is mere song and dance. I'm a musician, and if you know the amount of mathematics that goes into music, the amount of abstract, high-level thinking that goes into music. You see, one of the reasons why African Americans received such high status in Europe in the 1920s was because of their invention of jazz. And when people were able to compare jazz with the highest forms of European music, what they call their classical music, and jazz musicians were equaling and in some cases surpassing what the classical musicians could do, the respect that African Americans won because of that. So somebody like Miles Davis could go to France in the early 1950s and be treated as a scholar and a gentleman, where he could then move with Jean-Paul Sartre, move with Juliet Greco, move with the French New Wave artists and so on. And he was treated as one of them. Why? Because when people saw the intellectual basis behind jazz and the mathematics and the high level of abstract thought that went behind it, they realized, no, you can't write this off as entertainment. This is art of the highest order. When Americans were speaking about jazz in the 1940s, they were talking about Glenn Miller and all this kind of nonsense. In Europe, it wasn't about Glenn Miller. It was about Duke Ellington. And then you would get situations where Duke Ellington would sail into Britain or fly into Britain or whatever and book out, Westminster Hall for a 3-hour concert, his 1965 Sacred Concerts. This was a big thing. Why? It's Duke Ellington. Why? An art happening that is up there with anything Wagner produced, anything Rossini, Verdi. This is now on that kind of level. Mm-hmm. And what it is, again, in what we should be doing as we revolutionize the teaching, we have to revolutionize the teaching of how do we teach African dance and all its derivatives. And I can talk about all of its derivatives. How do we teach African music and all of its derivatives? Now, if we take dance, for example, in Europe, they had this idea of folk dances for the masses, and they had their idea of ballroom dances for the elites. Now, the ballroom dances, the main one is the foxtrot. And it turns out that the foxtrot can be traced back to African-American slaves. They used to do what were known as the plantation dances. And there was one called the bunny hug, and the bunny hug is what evolved into the foxtrot. Then you've got in South America, the samba, created by Brazilian slaves brought there from Central Africa. You had the rumba brought to Cuba by Afro-Cuban slaves. You had the tango brought to Argentina by Argentinian slaves. And so what happens is all of these dances that, remember, are part of high culture, it's not folk dance, high culture. You look at all the ballroom dances, fully 2/3 of them were invented by either this group of African people or that group of African people. And again, when we teach the history of this, again, if we had institutions and we were to get them to teach dance properly, that's what you need to say.
Excellent. This is very, very instructive, for all of us, the deep aspect of culture and what's behind, all of our, shall we say, cultural expressions. And I know you haven't even gotten into to food as a cultural expression, because that goes back to agriculture, it goes back to plants and the medicines that you get from plants, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a whole story there. Again, interfacing with my background in terms of plant medicines, and how many of the Western so-called medicines are extracts of plants where a molecule has been transformed, etc., so that it can be patented and then sold as something original. Okay, so I think we should stop here for the time being. and reconvene next week as we usually do. And